Hello. Today we're going to be looking at a game between Janowski and Rubinstein. Rubinstein has made many contributions to opening theory, particularly in the French, and he's most remembered for his rook endings, which he was just decades ahead of his time in. This game was played in 1907, two very strong grandmasters. The middle game is excellent. They both display a great understanding of positional chess. The endgame is an imbalanced rook ending, and that's what Rubinstein is, most notable for. The game begins with a e4 e5, turns into a four knights defense. We get the symmetrical Spanish variation. I don't have too much to say about this. It is not my area of expertise. It's very symmetrical. Black here moves the queen to e7, which looks a little bit strange. Usually you don't walk into a pin or bring your queen closer into a pin, but the idea is nice. The idea is to bring the knight back to d8 and reroute it to e6, and it's just better on e6. Potentially it'll go to f4, it'll kick the bishop, so a very nice idea. So we get knight d8, and white slides the bishop back to c4. Now, if we go knight e6, maybe they'll take, maybe they'll maintain the bishop pair. Black, he doesn't care too much for his light squared bishop, so he offers up this trade, and white retreats the bishop. Now, black doesn't want the bishop on e6, he'd rather the knight be there, so he's not afraid to trade. Here, white could take with the c pawn or the a pawn. If you take with the c pawn, yes, you fix your structure. However, if you take with the a pawn, you get a lot of activity. And though these are doubled pawns, they're not so bad as they control a lot of key squares, I would say. So black now gains a tempo with his knight, bringing it to e6. White wants to decline this trade, and black plays h6. So here it kind of reminds me of a hippo. I play the hippo a lot, and yes, it is a very different position. But in the hippo, you like to kind of get clamps here on f4 with the knights and attack on the king side. So I kind of see maybe that is a possibility that could happen or arise from this position. Here, Rubinstein played a6, and the idea of a6 I don't think is to expand on the queen side. I think it is more to free up this rook to be able to move. So, white's rook will now hit air. Took with the a pawn to make it active. a6 makes this rook a little less active. Here, white plays bishop g3, getting out of the pin. Or, I'm sorry, unpinning black, which doesn't look so strong, though I'm sure he had his reasons. Black took advantage of this and jumped in with his knight. So he now gains a tempo on the bishop, though you don't want to take this bishop. If you take this bishop, regardless of which pawn they take with, they're going to have control over f4, and then f4 becomes less of an outpost, right? We have both knights facing at f4. It's a very nice square for the knight. You probably want to jump in there with the knight. White plays pawn to d4, and black then jumps in with his e knight. The reason it's better to jump in with the e knight is if you jump in with the h knight, it might look better because the knight is on the side of the board. You want to bring it to the good square. Your other knight is centralized. However, principles in chess are made to be broken. Here, it would fail tactically to pawn takes pawn, and then you lose the pawn on e5, and your knights become destabilized, and white is all of a sudden better. So, he comes in with the e knight. He has enough defenders on e5 right now. White exchanges. You do not want to take with the pawn and give up the center, and then have a bad knight over here. You'd much rather improve the knight. White did not like this knight here, so they played pawn to g3. And here there's many things you could do with the position. You could go queen to e6, which is a nice move. It delays the fact that white cannot take. It's queen g4 check, and all of a sudden black would be better. You could move the knight to h3 check. King could come up. The knight could come back, or the queen could guard the knight. If the knight comes back, you might get a trade. Again, you have doubled pawns, but they're not so bad. However, he ended up retreating to g6, and we'll see why. He had a plan with this move. Queen to d3. White improves the square of their queen. He wants to drop back with this knight to d2, and then black plays queen e6. You can assume he wants to go knight e7, but black's move has an extra purpose, which is it prepares the move f5. So now there's two defenders on f5. and that is probably going to be his game plan. So he plays f5, and here white plays d5. So there's a lot of tension in the center. White did release the tension. Things to take note of are this queen, yes, it has to move, but now all of a sudden black is attacking the base of white's pawn chain. So this pawn might be rendered kind of weak in the future. White does take on f5, and black wants to avoid the queen trade right now, which I think makes sense. He believes he can use his queen more than white can use theirs. Also, when you take with the rook, you allow yourself to double up your rooks, and thanks to that a6 move, this rook is free to move off of the a file. White does get a good square for his knight on e4. It guards f2, and it's outposted in the center. No pawn could kick it out. So black doubles up the rooks. White is guarding the key square for now, and white rook lifts with rook to e3. We get knight to e7, and this is the first kind of positional idea that I was a fan of. Why go knight e7, these backwards knight moves? Well, the idea is that white's knight is so strong, so black would actually like to trade knights in this position, right? Then f2 would become kind of weaker, and black's rooks can aim in on that. White doubles up rooks, and this is the route he found. So, whereas you can maybe go knight c8, knight b6, move the queen, knight d7, knight f6, that takes like 5 moves. King h8, knight g8, knight f6, that takes 3 moves. That gains a couple tempo, and it's very solid. White does not do anything with the knight in the center, and black did not move here for the knights to stare at each other, so he removes it off the board. Now we get queen d8, and this move is fascinating. It brought up something that I've never seen in a game before, and partially why I was such a big fan of this game, aside from the endgame. We had queen g4, and here it's easy to think of like queen f6, tripling up, maybe rook g5, maybe queen g5. Instead, he goes queen b8, and this looks very strange. However, there's a very nice idea behind it. So white is weak on the dark squares. Black does not have a dark squared bishop, but he does have a queen, which can act as a dark squared bishop. So he actually brings it to b8 to use this luft of a pawn to infiltrate into the position, which is a very peculiar idea. I've never seen something like this. I was a big fan of this idea. And white was definitely not expecting queen b8. I can say that, that is a very hard move to expect. Everything is happening on the king side, and black just effortlessly comes into the position with his queen. Now, mind you, it's still equal, but white is the one that is tied down. So I feel like black is playing with a purpose, and white is just kind of trying to hold on. It's not fun to play these types of positions as white. Black consolidates on the dark squares. King g8, I assume because he wants his king closer to the center, anticipating an endgame. So you wouldn't want your opponent's king on the g file. When yours is on the h, they can win some races that you wouldn't want them to win then. And here, white offers up a queen trade. Now, you don't want to retreat and allow white to start pushing forward. So you want to trade on your own terms. Black pushes a5, white trades queens, and now we get this pawn on b4. These are not bad doubled pawns because the return you get on the open file is far greater than the weakness you get of the doubled pawns. It also kind of stagnates, not kind of, it definitely stagnates white's structure. So this is all good stuff. You get a pawn exchange and black claims the open file. So again, pretty equal position, though black is clearly the one playing for a victory. White starts marching his king to h3. I don't really know. There doesn't seem to be much of a plan here, but it's a try. Black plays b6, which is a very nice move. It stops c5, so white cannot destabilize the structure. Like, imagine white plays c5 here. It's a testing move. You obviously can't take because you don't even temporarily win a pawn. It just damages your structure, and it might give white the open c file in the future. So I think c5 would have been a good try for white. However, b6 stops that from ever being a thing, or temporarily stops it from being a thing. Maybe later it could be. White again is marching forward, but it doesn't look like this king can really make any progress, and black starts to infiltrate with the rook. Now, white is kind of just shuffling, whereas black looks like they're making progress. Okay, we got b4 maybe eyeing at c5, But then again, white just doesn't have much reasoning to his moves, I feel like. Black is closing in on white's king. It almost looks like white's king is in a mating box if there was no h-pawn. And we get rook to h1. Hitting this pawn and also threatening to bring the king to the side of the board and then ends up winning the h-pawn and maybe the rook. So white plays f4 in a mad dash to retreat the king the other way. However, f4 loses a pawn. You can exchange, there's different move orders, but you can exchange the pawn, isolating it by itself, so it's very weak. And then here, very important, h5. Not rook to g1. Rook to g1, it looks like it brings the king away to the h-file. Well, and then there would be checkmate. But it does not do that. And if king f3, maybe rook f1, so I can play that out. Like king f3, rook f1, they block. You could either take in either direction and you end up winning a pawn. However, the unfortunate thing about rook to g1 is there is rook to g3, right? Rook on the other side of the board. And though black is still pressing, white does not lose any material. If you do it this way, and kick them with the pawn, you do indeed win a pawn. Rook g1 check, king f2, and rook g4, doubling up on the pawn that has no defenders. So here white trades into an endgame, and now we get Rubinstein's bread and butter, a rook endgame, up a pawn. And what I like about this is Rubinstein just is so patient in this endgame. He does not rush at all, and it's very easy to lose positions where you're rushing. Like you have a slight edge, and you overestimate your edge, you rush, and then you lose. It's happened to me countless times. So his patience really demonstrates his mastery in these types of endgames. King to e3, rather than moving the rook, he guards it with the king, activating his king because it is an endgame, and we get king to d3. Now here, this check is very nice, rook to f3. The purpose of it is if white's king retreats, then you go rook h3, and you've got their king back on the first rank. Only way they could guard h2. So you've gotten their king back on the first rank, and very easy for black to make progress here. So white's king went to d4, trying to stay in the center of the board, and here black pokes a hole at the b4 pawn. And look at the position. I mean, it's the only weakness in white's position, and black targets it. So he pokes a hole again in white's position. White, rather than pushing the pawn, begins with a check. It's very important to be careful here. If you go king g4, you would end up losing this, and then maybe losing this. If you go king g5, again, you'll end up losing one of these. Not fun. So you have to go back. King g6. Patience. We get another check, and he goes to the h-file, still defending the g7 pawn. Now white is forced to move b4. Again, this next move shows good understanding of the position. He goes rook f3. It looks random until you think about it. If you give white two moves in this position, they would probably be like, okay, c7 is the weak point in this position. I'm going to attack c7. So routes to c7 would be f2, f7, and no bueno. So here black goes rook f3 to guard against this, or anticipating maybe rook e2, and then he has rook f7, and he's faster to the pawn. White attacks the rook. The rook can go, to multiple places. He chooses to go to f6. Everything's defended, and white wraps around on the far end of the board. Black makes progress, and then white attacks this. Now, here he gives a check to push the king back to d3. The less active your opponent's king is, the more active your position is. And then he goes to guard the c7 pawn, which was attacked by white's rook. Here we get c5, which is a scary looking move. If you take with the b pawn, then it would be tragic because white would push the b pawn, and all of a sudden you can lose this endgame as black, because this pawn is now pinned to the rook, and it's very close to making a queen, so that is very scary. Here we get d takes c5, another nice thing, right? Because back in this position, if they go here, you're just going to take c4 and guard c7. So they kind of have to go d3 to guard c4. And now you're able to take with the d pawn, because after d6, doing it this way, it does not work because the king is on the same file as the pawn. So rook d7 will pin the pawn to the king, and just like that, black is, completely fine. He was always fine, but you have to figure it out to be fine. That's not the easiest thing in the world. So we get a pawn exchange, and here it's very important. If black just went ahead pushing pawns, he would lose this game. He would lose because there's this amazing rook c6 pinning the rook to the king. And if the rook takes the rook, the king, well, it's obviously too far out of the queening box. It's 2 away. This king is on the other end of the board. So white would make a queen. And if rook g6, it looks like everything is fine for a moment until you realize white has a king. And now there's 2 attackers on this rook. Nothing else could defend it. They would be forced to take, and white would make a queen. So never too late to lose a chess game. He did find the move, rook to d4 check, moving the king. And now he pushes the pawn. And he's completely fine. There's no pin over here. Here, white decided to go rook c8. He could have tried rook c6, picking up the pawn, but black is just too fast on the king side. So he just, makes the game more painful, makes it last longer. Again, it's never too late to lose a chess game. Not that he would ever do that, but chess, things happen. Instead, we get rook check, pushing the king away, and there will never be a mate anymore after the king is now on the e-file, and black starts to make progress with his position. White gives a check, black gains a tempo, there's no more checks, so it allows black to make progress in the position. He goes king g6, another check, but the point is he's trying to escape onto g4 where there's no more checks. So white goes h3, but now black gains another move of progress. We get check, comes back to g6, check, h6, and then comes back, attacks the rook, gains another tempo. You see the pattern here. Now rook f3, protecting the pawn, attacking their pawn. We get rook c6, rook takes h3, and in this position, actually, white did resign because it's just hopeless. But, it's funny because in Grandmaster games, I feel like Grandmasters sometimes resign in positions, and you're like, wait, I don't even know who's winning. It's because they've mastered the subtleties, they've earned their respect, they understand everything. But yeah, sometimes you don't even know who's winning. But the reason is if white takes this pawn, black just has too many pawns and he's too fast, too far up the board. One variation could just be rook f3. Now white would probably want to move the pawn to create a queen. Important to always note the king's kind of where the king is in relation to the rest of the pieces. See, the queening square is in the same diagonal, so there could be a skewer here, and in fact that could be one way to win. Something like h3, b6, h2, see b7, queen does not last for long. And if you could say, like, what if white gives this check? Doesn't really make a difference if black queens, or I'm sorry, if white queens, because there's just too many checks on this board, and it's just going to be game over very soon. So I hope you enjoyed this game. So far ahead of its time in rook understandings, Rubinstein was. And the queen maneuver in the middle game was very impressive. And the knight reroute to trade knights with sliding the king over to h8 and getting it over to f6. Impressive stuff. I was a big fan, and I hope you guys enjoyed. Thank you.